Alrighty then. I'm adjusting this now. Okay. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 144. I'm your host, Panyo Basa. And I must say that 144 is about as non-prime of a number as numbers get in this world. In fact, it is a perfect square. It's 12 times 12. But if we factor it out completely, it's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 3 times 3. Not prime at all. This is my beverage. Did I mention that I'm Panyo Basa? So, my coffee's already cooling down. And I did realize just today that these little paper umbrellas really are non-functional. They're just for looks. It was rainy today. I took one out with me. Got just as wet as if I didn't have it. So, we got some good questions today, and I didn't bother to count how many there are, but it's kind of like an average number. And it's probably going to be after midnight by the time I'm done with this, because again, I'm starting late. I work nights now. I'm trying to start a word with L for some reason in that sentence. It just seemed like one of the words should start with L. Anyways, I work nights, so get up at like noon anyway. And then I had to run around town and like purchase objects and so forth. And then I got a haircut just minutes ago. I got a haircut. So I've got like little hairs down the back of my shirt so that I'm sort of like a postmodern equivalent of some medieval ascetic wearing a hair shirt. So before I get started with answering questions, though, I would like to give a shout out to somebody named Kevin, who has generously donated to the cause twice since the last time I shouted him out. So your generosity is acknowledged and appreciated. Oh, Kevin. And with that, I suppose I should just wade right into this, start answering questions. And the first question is from Dama River. And this is like a good introductory question. He says, before you became a monk, at which point did it click in your head that you wanted to go forth? Was it a sudden realization that something was broken in the world, or that you were in a sort of dream world? Or was it a traumatic experience, a romantic heartbreak, or too much suffering? Or was it just an intuitive decision without any major event triggering the beginning of your spiritual pursuit? What was it? And it's a question that I've answered more than once in the past, but it's been a while. So I may as well give like a very abbreviated version of my life story. So when I was a kid, like almost all other kids in this world, I just assumed that adults knew what's what. You know, it's just taken for granted. And certain adults know what's what even better than other adults do. Like, for example, when I was a kid, two of my role models were the professor on Gilligan's Island, who, I mean, he could do anything with his knowledge of science. And also Mr. Spock on Star Trek, who was kind of the same. You know, he was like a half alien space professor. But then around the age of 13, I started to become suspicious that adults really didn't know what's what. And by the time I was 16, it was just painfully obvious that the adults were just as clueless and messed up as I was, as a general rule. So when I was about 16 years old, I just went into open rebellion, got into lots of trouble, started skipping school, went from like an honor student to almost failing out of school, and just went. I guess what caused it was my 16th birthday was the first time I was ever higher than a Georgia pine and drunk as the proverbial skunk, both at the same time. I was like a skunk in a pine tree. And at the time, I mean, I remember I was laughing so hard I just fell forwards onto the ground, just face down on the ground, still laughing. And it just seemed so brilliant at the time. You know, sick for a 16-year-old. It's like, wow, I've just discovered a new way. And so that's one of the reasons why I went into the open rebellion. I had this philosophy, if you want to be happy, don't do anything you don't want to do, which includes going to school sometimes, things like that, reporting into your father when you're not going to come home for a couple days, that kind of thing. And so I got into lots of trouble. And so one night in a towering rage, my father gave me like this ultimatum. It was like, let's see, go to a kind of it was like a halfway house or something. I can't remember exactly. It was sort of like the equivalent of a halfway house for like teenagers. Or I could see a youth counselor, or I could just like hit the road just because he was just fed up with it. And so seeing the youth counselor seemed like the least inconvenient option. And so I started seeing a youth counselor whose name was Ron Sherman. And it turned out that Mr. Sherman was a wise man. And he could see something in me, I guess, or maybe he would just try and convey a little Eastern philosophy to all of his clients, his troubled teenage clients. But with me, it really hit. I mean, it really struck a chord. He gave me books by Ram Dass to read. I thought it was Ram Dass at first. And so I'm reading these books like the Only Dance There Is, and also Grist for the Mill. Grist for the Mill really made a strong impression on me as a teenager. And I didn't really understand it very well. It was so alien to anything I'd been exposed to before that it couldn't really integrate. But nevertheless, intuitively, I felt this is worthwhile. This is better than what I rejected at first, which is screwed up adults just trying to be happy, failing because they don't know how. Just he who dives with the most toys wins. Just take the salmon approach, just swim upstream, spawn, and die. That kind of thing. So I rejected that already, but just the roller coaster ride of just partying and getting into trouble and partying and getting into trouble. I mean, that wasn't working very well either. And all of a sudden, there's this guy named Ram Dass talking about how you can understand ultimate reality. There's like this higher level of truth that is it's like was a quantum leap beyond what normies consider to be reality. And that, I mean, it's just a quantum leap beyond what normies experience just with regard to the quality of it. It's just something that you should dedicate your life towards mastering. And youthful idealist that I was, it was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. And so starting with the age of about 17, because it was right before my 17th birthday that this shit really hit the fan. And I was, my 16th year it was like the year of youthful rebellion and chaos, being a feral teenager. So around the end of that year, that's when my father put his foot down and I decided I was going to see the youth counselor and so forth. And so, yeah, it was around the age of 17, I had this idea that I should renounce the world and become like some kind of renunciant ascetic and do my best to realize ultimate truth, to know ultimate reality, to transcend samsara, so to speak. But I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to go about it. I knew myself well enough to know that just being non-denominational, I mean, I considered it for a while, just like get myself a wool robe and some kind of wool bowl, a wooden bowl, not a wool bowl, a wood bowl, and just take off walking. But I knew myself well enough to know that I wasn't good enough at self-discipline at the time, especially, that, I mean, it wasn't going to work out very well. It would be better to like enter into some established tradition with like tried and tested rules and methods and so forth. That would work better. And so I was considering Zen, because I was pretty much converted to Buddhism by reading Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, compiled by Paul Reps. So I still favored Zen back then. I briefly was even considering just becoming like a Carthusian Christian monk that undertakes a vow of silence. And with the vow of silence, I wouldn't have to confess that I actually wasn't a Christian. But I realized that was a dumb idea. Probably they'd have to break their vow of silence to make confession somehow anyway. So that was the point where it clicked. I mean, it wasn't just like one sudden click, but it was mainly my interactions with this youth counselor who was into Ram Dass and reading, especially Grist for the Mill by Ram Dass. That, I mean, it was just like opening up this whole new possibility of how to live my life that seemed just infinitely superior to just being like a middle class normie with, you know, the wife and the kids and the dog and the mortgage and the car payments and the insurance and all this. That just seemed like walking death to me at the time. Now that I'm kind of detached, you know, from 30 years of being a monk, I realize that, you know, it's like your attitude towards your environment is really essential. And it's not really that your surroundings that are all important. It's just your attitude. So I can go back to like working for a living and so forth now with a different attitude than the average guy has towards it, I suppose. But I'm just rambling all over because the actual question was, at which point did the click go in my head that I wanted to go forth? And it was around the age of 17, and I had this ambition that before the age of 30, I should definitely have renounced the world. And so I was ahead of schedule on that. I was like 27. But yeah, that's essentially it. And so I'm just going to move on to Dhamma River's second question, which is, what was the worst aspect of being a monk? And the first thing that popped in my head was just celibacy, just no orgasms except for maybe when you're sleeping. But thinking about it, that wasn't really the worst aspect. It was the most difficult aspect. And like a lot of the time, especially when I was younger, you know, you're just full of juice. It's like there were times when I was just like climbing the walls, just wanting to cry and howl like a dog. I was so horny, essentially. But that wasn't really the worst aspect. I think the worst aspect of being a monk is having to rely on other people to be able to do just about anything, really. I mean, if you're just living alone out in the forest, you have to rely on other people for your food. But if you want to do anything that costs money, for example, and you're a conscientious monk that doesn't handle money, you've got to rely on other people. You got to rely on other people to do stuff that as a layperson you could just do yourself really easily. And I've always been relatively self-sufficient. You know, if I can do something myself, I'd rather just do it myself than to even have help doing it. I'm still that way at work. I really don't like people helping me unless I just cannot do this thing by myself, and then I'll ask someone to help me. But so for me, I think that was really the worst aspect of being a monk, is just having to rely on other people for so much that as a layperson, you can just do freely, practically effortlessly on your own. Like I mentioned, I mean, you can't even feed yourself. I mean, once they give you the food, then of course you shovel the food into your own mouth, but just acquiring the food, you can't even do that. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Hui Cheer. I don't know how to pronounce his name. It's really not a particularly common name. And so I'm just calling him Hui Cheer. I hope he's not offended by my mispronouncing his name. And he says, do you think Alan Watts and Eckhart Tolle enlightened? I have been listening to their YouTube videos. They sound like they got it. And Eckhart Tolle is always just kind of a question mark for me. And Alan Watts, I know less about Alan Watts than I know about Eckhart Tolle. I've read a couple of Alan Watts's books. I've heard a few of his videos on YouTube. And he says the right things, but just because you say the right things doesn't mean that you're enlightened. I mean, Alan Watts, supposedly there were some kind of scandals about his life, but then again, there were scandals about like J. Krishnamurti too. And I'm still open-minded with regard to the realizations of J. Krishnamurti. So, I mean, you can't really know. I mean, with regard to Eckhart Tolle or Alan Watts or anybody you think might be enlightened, just seeing their public appearances and like hearing their speeches and so forth, it's not really enough to know, because like St. Francis of Assisi said, you don't really know somebody until you see them when everything's going wrong. Like somebody betrays them, somebody that they felt that they could trust, just like stabs them in the back, that kind of thing. How do they react then? You know, how do they react under a situation that normally triggers people? That's when you can have a better idea as to just how wise this person really is. Because if they're saying all the right things and they seem peaceful and serene, but then they're just like losing their shit over something, you know, it's like some unusual situation, some bad situation they don't like, then they're not really enlightened, at least not according to the standard Theravada Buddhist interpretation of enlightenment. But then again, from the standard Theravada Buddhist interpretation of enlightenment, I mean, they couldn't laugh, that kind of thing. They certainly wouldn't get married. So, yeah, I mean, it's, and then also there's just the further confoundment of the idea that from an unenlightened point of view, there is no enlightenment. There's like an unenlightened person can have an idea about enlightenment, but that idea is going to be unenlightened. Their criteria for judging whether somebody is enlightened or not is going to be unenlightened. And so an unenlightened person is just going to be looking at the world through unenlightened glasses, unenlightenment tinged glasses. And so even the people they think are enlightened, really their whole criteria for judging whether another person is enlightened is going to be unenlightened. So in a way, it's sort of like a Zen Buddhist way of looking at things. I derived the idea from the sutra, the platform sutra of Hui Neng, where he says, once you become enlightened, you look around and see that everybody else is enlightened. You know, it's like you're, from an enlightened point of view, you look around and it's all like nirvana. Whereas if you're unenlightened, you look around and you just see unenlightenment. You see samsara. So there's that too. But if I just had to guess offhand, Eckhart Tolle, he had some kind of realization, but I really cannot say just how advanced he is from like a more traditional point of view, like establishment Buddhism or establishment Hinduism. I really can't say. And Alan Watts, I just have insufficient data to really have much of an idea. There's a lot of you probably know what's his name? Ken Wheeler, you know, the tattooed monkey guy. He says Alan Watts is just flat out evil. But then again, Ken Wheeler says that Trader Joe's grocery stores are also flat out evil. So I guess the correct answer to Hui Chir's question is, I don't know. And based on like the information that I have regarding these two gentlemen, I don't think it would even be possible to know unless I was like some sort of fully enlightened being with psychic powers and could just see them clearly, you know, more clearly than an unenlightened person sitting in the same room with them. But just because you sound like you got it doesn't necessarily mean that you got it. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, does celibacy have any metaphysical merit? And I mean, an outward act or outward absence of acts really is not meritorious. It's all mental. So whether celibacy has any metaphysical merit or not depends on your mental states. And as a general rule, it does. I mean, it's meritorious in a way. You know, it gets you closer to enlightenment, or at least it can for a lot of people, which is why the Buddha, apparently also Jesus of Nazareth, many other spiritual teachers have encouraged celibacy. But it doesn't work for everybody, just like Jesus says with regard to his three kinds of eunuchs. You know, there's those who are born eunuchs, those who are made eunuchs, and those who are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And then the next thing he says is, it's not for everybody, because some people, they'll be celibate, but then they're just horny as hell all the time. You know, it's like a starving man just thinking about food all the time. You got some celibate renunciant just thinking about sex all the time. I mean, it can happen. I was like that sometimes. So, I mean, you can get demerit from being celibate too, if that's the kind of celibate you are. You're just scoping out every female that you come across. I mean, a lot of guys who aren't celibate are like that too. Like Ram Dass pointed out that there's some people, some guys especially, they go to a party, they just immediately categorize everybody into three categories. There's women that you could possibly score with. There's guys who are like competition for the women you could possibly score with. And then there's just like insignificant nobodies that you don't pay any attention to. So if you're celibate and you have this kind of attitude, you know, even just potentially, then yeah, you're going to get demerit too. But in Buddhism, it's not all black or white. It's almost impossible to do anything that's pure good or pure evil. It's always a shade of gray. So for some people, celibacy is light gray, and for other people, celibacy can be dark gray. I mean, you got like prison inmates in prison who, I mean, they're celibate. I mean, they're sort of like incels, I guess. Either that or they're just buggering some twink, if you'll pardon the expression. But there are some who just like are staunchly heterosexual. And so they're going to be celibate in prison, but that doesn't make them saints. So, yeah, so celibacy, just celibacy in and of itself is sort of like ethically neutral, because it's the mental states that really determine whether something is good or bad, meritorious or unmeritorious, wholesome or unwholesome. As it turns out, though, I mean, some actions are extremely difficult to do with wholesome mental states, which is one reason why there's precepts, you know, don't steal, don't lie, that kind of thing. Because it's difficult to steal or lie without having unwholesome mental states that are creating bad karma for yourself. But celibacy in general is considered to be a good thing in Theravada Buddhism. And as a general rule, at least a person who is sincerely trying to live a dharmic life, then celibacy is better than the alternative from the traditional Theravada Buddhist point of view that's found all the way back in the Pali texts. You know, it's pretty strenuously stressed in the Pali texts that, you know, the Buddha says you should avoid having sex with a woman the way you would avoid falling into a deep pit of burning coals, this kind of thing. So it's not for everybody. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, if I wiped everyone's mind of the number 3, would 3 still exist? No, it would not. I mean, even if you're a nominalist, you reject some 3 up in Plato's heaven, you know, like the primordial 3 that's supposed to exist, and it just sort of infuses with 3-ness any group of 3, or just the abstract idea of 3, like when people are doing math, that kind of thing. If nobody's thinking of it, it doesn't exist. I mean, multiplicity doesn't exist unless somebody is thinking of it. And that would include threeness. So, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. I'm going to check to see if we are recording. Yeah, we are. At least it says we are. Okay, Xenothoid says, well, I definitely, this is sort of like three complicated, kind of longish political economic questions, I think. Anyway, Xenothoid says, while I definitely consider myself a social conservative, I know that I don't know shit about economics or political theory. If I were to seriously and objectively research these topics, I may either become a classic far-right conservative or a social conservative or fiscal liberal, which I guess would be the opposite of libertarian. Apparently, there is a political party called National Bolshevism, or NASBOL, which combines right-wing social positions and traditionalism with left-wing economic theory. This is not the only socially conservative and fiscally liberal political party, but it seems to be the most popular one and actually has some prominence in places like Russia. Perhaps this ideology can fix the mistake Marx made in believing the blank slate theory while still keeping potentially good points from his economics. Have you ever heard of or had any experience with NASBOLs? No. Long question, one syllable answer. No, I've never heard of National Bolsheviks. And I'm not sure if his next question or questions are going to refer to this in further detail, but I mean, socialism, it's really kind of an ethical, like a conundrum. It's like, if you don't have socialism, you know, it's like you don't have like the government, you don't have a welfare state, let's say. So, I mean, you're going to have people who are just hitting rock bottom, just freezing to death in the wintertime, maybe starving to death, dying of easily curable diseases, this kind of stuff. And I mean, from just a hard-nosed nationalist point of view, or just like a Darwinian point of view, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. It's like the weak are just, you know, the misfits are just being purged by Darwin, you know, and it's the strong are succeeding, which should be a good thing, at least from that point of view. Whereas in socialism, I mean, it has its bad points. It's like it like lifts up the people that can't really compete. You know, it keeps them going, and they're able to just keep reproducing and have children that also can't compete. So from a Darwinian point of view, it's kind of, I mean, you don't really have devolution, but it's kind of tending in that direction. You know, it's causing what Edward Dutton is always ranting about, how, you know, you've just got all these like mutational load and lowered intelligence and so forth, because it's like you don't have the least capable of competing dying out. And so it's, in a way, it's vitiating the species, vitiating the population. It's making it less robust, less intelligent, less strong, etc. But from an ethical point of view, you should have compassion. So, I mean, personally, I mean, I ranted a little bit about this in a previous Q&A, possibly the one right before this, where, I mean, it's not good to let people just starve to death or freeze to death. I mean, there should be some compassion and you should help them. It'd be better, though, first of all, if it's private charity, instead of just paying more taxes and letting the government do it. Because if it's private charity, not only do you not have a socialist welfare state, but you get to choose who you're going to help, for starters, and also you're gathering up treasures in heaven. I mean, you are doing something meritorious by helping somebody with your own volition, rather than just having money deducted from your paycheck as taxes And then some bureaucracy, some corrupt bureaucracy, maybe, distributing like a percentage of that, certainly not all of it, to poor people who are then using the money to buy nachos and purple drink and just having diabetes, all these health problems from like just foolish choices, and just having packs of kids that they also can't really take care of. So I really don't think that Marxism or like some sort of like socially conservative socialism, I mean, it'd be an improvement over like degenerate socialism, but socialism in general should be kept to a minimum, and it would be better to just promote as much as you can private charity to help people in need. And that's the way it used to be back when Western civilization was predominantly Christian. It would be like churches would take care of the poor. People would donate to their church, they'd pass the plate around or whatever, and then there'd be church groups that would be helping the poor. And that would be preferable to having the government do it. But I'm not even answering the questions. I mean, the answer to the question is just a simple no, because I've never heard of or had any experience with Nazbols. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's second question, which is, do you think social conservatism and fiscal liberalism are compatible? And that's the actual question, but some people, including Xenothoid, like having like some explanatory commentary to kind of fill out the question, I guess. Make sure that I don't answer the wrong question or some such. So after saying, do you think social conservatism and fiscal liberalism are compatible? He says, I'm sure many of the most hardened commies from the Russian Revolution would vomit at modern leftist moral degeneracy, even if they were fed up with what was considered traditional at the time. While I don't think early Christianity is a good example of social right, fiscal left political thought, as they would have been the social lefties of their day, many modern Christians are appalled by capitalism for its mammon worship. There's actually a subreddit called r/conservative socialist with a lot of people on it who seem sensible enough, which makes me more interested in this obscure section of the political landscape. Okay, so getting up here, social conservatism, which is like having moral standards, like traditional, conservative, old-fashioned moral standards, which, I mean, there can be all kinds of different kinds of social conservatism. I'm sure Buddhist social conservatism would be very different from Muslim social conservatism. And fiscal liberalism, well, I mean, liberalism is kind of a weird word because a lot of people in America, especially like people who vote Republican, consider liberals to just be any person who's left wing. So that even like a Marxist would be called liberal, which I just don't see that. So fiscal liberalism, social conservatism and fiscal liberalism. So fiscal liberalism, I would assume, would be a welfare state, or at the very least, you're going to have the government having some socialized tasks, like, up until relatively recently, the Postal Service had kind of a government socialized monopoly on sending mail. Now, of course, you've got other groups that are doing it even a little better in some cases. Or just like taking care of roads, maintaining public lands like national parks, that kind of thing. I mean, that's a kind of socialism that even conservatives, partly because they don't realize that it's socialized, that they can be on board with that. But fiscal liberalism, I assume it means like a welfare state. It's like the poor people just get checks from the government, low income public housing, that kind of thing. So, do I think social conservatism and fiscal liberalism are compatible? Yeah, I mean, they could fit together. I mean, it would make the fiscal liberalism or like the economic leftism a little more stable a little less self-destructive. Because when you've got like social leftism, which is just anything goes, it's kind of libertarianism with no ethical principles really holding it, just keeping it on track, just anything goes. And then when you combine that with a welfare state, then really it's just sort of a toboggan ride downwards. But again, I'm not nearly as left-wing economically as I was in my younger days. Not even then, I was sort of like a social eco-libertarian. And I was endorsing pretty much what I endorsed just a matter of minutes ago, where it's like, you shouldn't allow some law-abiding citizen to freeze to death or starve to death or die of some easily curable disease. That they should get sort of a bare minimum, at least, enough to keep them healthy, at least with regard to easily curable diseases. I don't think the government should necessarily fork out millions of dollars to give someone some long, difficult cancer treatment that maybe is only, 20% likely to save the person anyway. That's when you have socialized healthcare, you have the government playing God, deciding who is going to survive and who isn't, sort of like triage in like a battlefield hospital. And then it becomes corrupt too, because the government always becomes corrupt. So what is the actual question? Do I think social conservatism and fiscal liberalism are compatible? Yeah, in theory, it's compatible. And I think social conservatism would combine with fiscal liberalism better than social liberalism would combine with fiscal liberalism. Because people would be encouraged to be self-sufficient. They'd be encouraged to get a job instead of having just being on welfare, being like an unwed mother on welfare, having that be seen as a viable career choice. And back not too long ago, women were shamed into being wed mothers instead of unwed ones. But when you've got the government just sending you money, then you can just do as you please. Sort of. So I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, which is an equally long question. So, have there ever been any attempts at a kind of Buddhist communism or Buddhist socialism that were still genuinely in line with Buddhist ethics and tradition? ? That's the question. And then he continues, I'd like to think that there have been at least some Buddhist political leaders groups who really did want to help the poor without getting swept up in the bullshit of Western liberal ideology, while the Buddha definitely wasn't a commie. With an attachment to lay people having perfect, easy lives, he did express some fiscal liberalism in the suttas, such as saying poverty causes crime and that there should be some redistribution of wealth. However, I think Buddhism is fundamentally opposed to communist ideals in spirit because it is about the flourishing of a small spiritual elite, where only the best of the best achieve the goal, not a please do all the work for me religion like Christianity. Buddhism requires a kind of leisure class in monastics and certainly isn't set on making an earthly utopia, the desire to always have all your material needs met, as if it would ever end your suffering is fundamentally retarded and un-Buddhist. Okay, so let's get up to the actual question. Have there ever been any attempts at a kind of Buddhist communism or Buddhist socialism that were still genuinely in line with Buddhist ethics and tradition? Well, I mean, the Emperor Ashoka would have been like a prototype of that. Because, I mean, he was definitely into Buddhism. The Emperor Ashoka of India, definitely Buddhist. And he was trying to rule through Dharma, where he's trying to keep like law enforcement and that kind of stuff to a minimum, where what was supposed to govern the country and just sort of keep it like regularized is just, he's just promoting Dharma and just encouraging everybody to be as dharmic as they can. And then he was sort of relying on like a kind of honor system where people would live dharmic lives. But at the same time, he set up like hospitals. Even he set up like veterinary hospitals where people could go, or they could bring their dog or whatever and be treated for free. So that's kind of a step towards socialism. You know, it'd be libertarianism kind of, but it would be guided by, you know, Buddhist principles. And then he had a kind of primitive socialism going. So there is that. And also, I might as well mention that back around the 1980s, I think, Burma, it was like the Burmese, I can't remember exactly what the slogan was. It was the Burmese approach to socialism. That they were going to have a kind of Buddhist socialism. But of course, it's run by a military dictatorship. And so it's kind of like the mafia trying to run a Buddhist socialist state. And it didn't work at all. You know, at the very beginning, the government just comes in and just, what is it? Not socializes, but what is it when the government just like confiscates your business? You know, it's the opposite of privatizing it. That happened a lot. There were like prosperous shop owners and so forth in Burma. And then when the Burmese military government decided they're going to try to be socialists, they're going to be Buddhist socialists, they just confiscate people's shops, and things just went downhill from there. So there have been attempts. I think Ashoka's attempt, even though it probably wasn't extremely socialist, not by modern standards, nevertheless, you know, it was encouraging compassion. He was no doubt encouraging private charity as much as he could, not only to lighten the load on the government, but also to like encourage people to earn merit through helping the poor and so forth. And even like Islam does the same, Christianity does the same, Judaism does the same. At least in the texts, it encourages people to help the poor. But of course, even when Christianity was pretty much universal, with all this emphasis on help the poor, you still had people starving to death and freezing to death and so forth. So I guess I answered that question. Let's just move on to the next one, which is from Romeo. And Romeo says, I sometimes attend meditation sessions and Dhamma talks at my local Buddhist temple. In addition to offering meditation and Dhamma discussions, this temple also hosts Kung Fu classes. Is there any historical and or philosophical link between Buddhism and any of the martial arts? If so, which ones and how? Well, I don't know if Romeo is American. If he is American, he's not old enough to remember the old Kung Fu TV show, which is about Shaolin monks in China, Shaolin monks, their Dhamma practice, it's sort of like their meditative practice, consists largely of martial arts. It's just sort of like, I don't know how to explain it really. It's just like you're in the present moment, you're not thinking, you just become a master of martial arts through just being, in harmony with the moment. And then they can like throw spears at you and you're just dodging the spears and so forth. So, obviously Shaolin Buddhism, which is a kind of Mahayana Buddhism in China. And nowadays there's like the original Shaolin monastery in China that I think the government just allowed it to continue for tourism purposes. They make money from the tourism. And I don't know how much the monks there are really interested in Dharma. It's more of just kind of a martial arts school, maybe. But in Mahayana Buddhism, there's all kinds of stuff. It's sort of like the strictness of the early Indian schools just got blown wide open, and almost anything goes. Tantric Buddhism, just you can do all these things that in the early texts is just strictly prohibited. There's one example also with regard to Burma, is that before the Burmese converted to Theravada Buddhism at the decree of King Anuruddha of Pagan, that they mainly were following a kind of tantric Buddhism called Mahāri. And it's not Maha-Arya like the great nobles. I think it's comes from the word aranya in Pali, or Sanskrit, which means forest. So it's like the great forest tradition. But they drank alcohol and they ate in the afternoon. And apparently they had what is called the jus primae noctis, which means that before a girl got married, some village girl got married, the night before her wedding night, she got sent to the monastery to learn the ways of love or whatever. But these Maha-Ari monks also practiced a kind of boxing, which, I mean, might be a mistranslation into English. It could be some kind of martial arts, maybe some kind of kickboxing or something. But it does happen, especially in Mahayana, not nearly so much in Theravada. If you've got martial arts, like monks practicing martial arts, like maybe like Thai monks or Burmese monks doing Thai or Burmese kickboxing, just sort of as an amateur, amongst themselves at the monastery or something, they would be considered lax, sloppy, shameless monks. Probably happens, but it would not be the most serious, conscientious monks who were doing that sort of thing. In Theravada, Mahayana is a whole different story. So, I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Quasator. And Quasator says, when a being comes out of hell, do they need to recover from the trauma, or is all that forgotten in their new life? It kind of reminds me of something Ram Dass said in one of his books about how you can kind of tell if a baby is coming from above or below. Because like a baby who has had a fortunate, pre-birth experience, or just sort of a tendency towards pleasant, non-harmful pre-birth experiences, in their previous life, they're happy babies. They don't cry a lot. They're not as fussy. They trust strangers. Like some stranger can come hold the baby's fine with it. Whereas other babies who did not come from higher up, they cry a lot. They're fussy. They'll just start screaming if someone they don't know picks them up, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think a being who comes out of hell and is born as a human, they probably would still have a lot of baggage from their previous, eons of torment. They would not be just a happy-go-lucky, cheerful kind of person who trusts strangers and so forth. That they would probably be relatively unhappy kinds of people, just from the momentum of their past life, and just it's had its effect on them. But I can't really speak from my own personal experience, because I do not recall having been in hell before I was born. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA has got more than 3 questions here. But since at least 2 of his questions are extremely simple questions to answer, I think I might let this slide, even though he's tried to trick me here. So his first question is, what are your thoughts on the show Black Mirror? Never saw it. I don't think I've ever even heard of it. No idea. Utterly clueless. PSA's second question. Which Netflix show or movie would you recommend with subliminal or unintentional Buddhist lessons? I don't have Netflix. I don't watch Netflix. We had Netflix like a couple years ago. Didn't watch it a whole heck of a lot. I think maybe The Walking Dead was on Netflix, even though it didn't originally appear on Netflix. But I think they were showing The Walking Dead, which is like the only show I was watching on Netflix back then. But there was also a series called The Crown that my woman and I watched, which is about Queen Elizabeth II. But I mean, that's it. That's my my knowledge of Netflix. I can't really answer this question either. I couldn't recommend any Netflix shows or movies with subliminal or unintentional Buddhist lessons. I mean, if The Walking Dead really is on Netflix, then you got recollection of death, that kind of thing, and that's about it. So I'm just going to move on to PSA's third question, which is as follows. When you lived in a cave in Burma, did you actually live there the whole time, or did you spend the day in the cave and go back to your kuti at night? I'm just worried about you being bitten by ticks at night and harassed by bats. Well, you don't have to be worried because I'm not there anymore. And I think you'd be more likely to be bitten by ticks in a hut than in a cave. I would just guess offhand. Let's see here. Did I actually live? Yeah, I mean, when I lived in a cave, I didn't have a kuti. Usually the cave would have like a thatched roof in front of it, either like abutting the side of the cave, or else, it'd be like, 15 feet in front of the cave. There'd just be like this little platform, like a bamboo platform with a thatched roof or a bamboo roof. And I'd like eat my meals there, because you don't want to eat meals in a cave. If you live in a cave, you're better off not eating your meals there, because just one crumb falls onto the floor without you noticing. There's going to be an ant finds it, and then it's going to alert its entire colony, and you're going to have just thousands of ants looking for the second crumb. So I would go out in the morning and eat my meal under the roof, sitting on the bamboo platform. But I would sleep inside the cave, spend the days inside the cave. I just pretty much live inside the cave most of the time. And the only time I was harassed by bats, the main cave that I lived in this cave for, at least 8 years. At first there was it had a wooden door, and it had like mosquito mesh over the window, which it's kind of like windows like this. And because of the mosquito mesh, there was almost no air circulation inside that cave. And so it was just too stuffy for me to really sleep inside that cave with the doors closed. I'd have to leave the doors open at night, and then bats would come in, and then I would have to get up before dawn and close the doors so that the bats couldn't spend the night there, because, you don't want bats spending the night in your cave if it's like an enclosed small cave. For starters, it takes like 2 weeks off your lifespan. Every time you're trying to do walking meditation inside this cave and this bat just swoops right at your face, it's 2 weeks off your life right there. And also they pee where they're hanging upside down, and it just stinks, and they're kind of creepy looking. If you ever seen a bat close up, there was a couple times where I'd wake up after dawn, and the bat had already come inside, and you cannot get rid of a bat. You can't get a bat to fly out into broad daylight. It's just going to do everything it can to avoid going out into broad daylight. And you just look at it close up, and they're like vibrating, and they got like these little gargoyle faces, and they're like kind of vibrating all the time. It's just weird. So eventually, within a relatively short time, one of the first modifications I made to that cave was to get a kind of chicken wire screen door put up, with, like spaces, this big, like an inch across, that bats couldn't get through. It kept out mostly rats, bats, humans, and snakes. So bats weren't a problem there. Also, when I lived at Olando Katapa National Park, there was a great big cave there. And just the opening of it was like 100 feet wide and like 30 feet high. So there were bats in there, but it was such a spacious cave, they didn't bother me. There was a few times they were actually kind of helpful, where I'd be doing walking meditation at night, and there'd be like a mosquito. You could hear this mosquito whining around me, and then a bat would whip by, and then it'd be silent. It just zipped in to get the mosquito, and took off again. Although there was one time I was sitting in that cave and I felt something on my arm. I looked down, I'm looking right down into the face of this little gargoyle. This little bat was just like clinging to my shoulder right there. So yeah, ticks, I never had much of a problem with ticks. I mean, you live out in the forest, then just walking through the trails, you're more likely to get ticks than if you're just staying by yourself. Bed bugs are a different matter. I mean, bed bugs, you have to always be on the alert. First time my cave got infested with bed bugs, I didn't know what they were. I'd never seen a bed bug before. I thought they were like baby cockroaches or something. And then one day, I'm reading a book in my cave and one of them is crawling across the book. So I just kind of flick it off like this and it splattered bright red blood. And I have a degree in biology. I know that insects don't have bright red blood, but that I do. And then I realized, and I started looking for them, and they were just everywhere. I mean, it was an ordeal getting rid of those bed bugs, especially for a Buddhist monk who's not supposed to be killing them. You're not supposed to be using poisons and so forth. Although you are allowed by Vinaya to take your bedding and spread it out in the sun, which pretty much kills the bed bugs, because even if the sunlight and the heat doesn't kill them, the ants find them. And then you've got like this ant highway of ants carrying little bed bugs back to their nest. So I'm giving really long, rambling answers to questions here. So I guess the question is, when you lived in a cave in Burma, did you actually live there the whole time, or did you spend the day in the cave and go back to your kuti at night? Didn't have a kuti. And in fact, in Burma, you talk about a kuti, that's the bathroom. That's the outhouse. That, I mean, like a monk's hut would be his kamatan jaun, his meditation building or something. Kuti just usually in Burmese means a monastery outhouse. But kuti in Pali does mean a hut. So, yeah, I just pretty much lived in the cave all the time and would just spend the mornings outside. I'd meet visitors and so forth outside. And so now PSA has his transgressive Pyth question. He's got question number pi. And he says, do you hold any resentment in your heart towards the non-tachyonics? And no, I'm forgiving of the non-tachyonics. And then he says, notice that pi is a valid number, safely placed between 3 and 4, not quite 4 yet. Therefore, no transgression has been committed, but yeah, actually it has, because the limit is 3. Anything more than 3 is transgressive, even if it's not all the way to 4 yet. 3 is the limit. 3 shall be the number of the count. Okay. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita, which is like Siddha is like accomplishment or attainment. Attainment achieved, copper mind, something like that. So anyways, Siddhartha Lohachita says, acting with determination, or adhitthana, can overcome bad karma, ? Or acting with determination is also a mental karma, ? If you decide to act with determination, with clarity of purpose, without doubt, are you creating the force of your life? ? Or at some point, can the stream of past karmas prevent you from fulfilling that will? ? So if you're paying attention, you may have noticed that there are 4 question marks in what is supposedly one question. And that's not even his only question. So anyways, let's try to tease out what the actual question is here. So it's with regard to determination, or adhitthana, which is one of the 10 paramis in Theravada Buddhism. Determination. Unflinching determination. Okay, can it overcome bad karma? Or acting with determination is also a mental karma? Well, I mean, it's like a quality of your karma. I mean, determination is like just unflinching. I mean, it's like more, I want to say determined. It's like unwavering. It's like, like a determined action would be like an unwavering action that you're not going to give up halfway through. So, I mean, that could be something good or something bad. I mean, it is considered to be one of the 10 paramis, one of the 10 perfections in Theravada Buddhism. So, I mean, it is considered to be a good thing. I mean, you have to have a certain determination to attain the goal. Unflinching determination. But, I mean, it can also be something bad. I mean, you're just absolutely determined to get revenge on some enemy, then that would not be meritorious determination there. So, can acting with determination overcome bad karma? Well, I mean, overcoming bad karma, I'm not exactly sure what Siddhartha is referring to here. I mean, bad karma, I mean, once it's there, it's got to run its course. So you're not going to make it disappear. You're not going to make it become less, really, through determination, through acting with determination now. You know, it's already too late. You know, it's closing the barn door after the horse has gotten out. So, yeah, it's like determination is like a quality of your mental states that, you know, it's just sort of like an intensifier, so to speak. So let's see here. If you decide to act with determination, with clarity of purpose, without doubt, or you creating the force of your life, yeah, I mean, it's still karma. Yeah, I mean, definitely you're still creating karma. I mean, in fact, it could be a stronger kind of karma. So if you're doing a meritorious deed with determination, it's going to strengthen the karma of that meritorious deed. If you're doing a demeritorious deed with determination, it can strengthen the demerit. So, or at some point, can the stream of past karmas prevent you from fulfilling that will? I mean, you can have like mental momentum. That's essentially what karma is. It's like the momentum of your mental states, kind of the momentum of your stream of consciousness, so to speak. It won't necessarily, I mean, it can effectively prevent you from fulfilling some determination. But I mean, still, I mean, you can overcome that if you try hard enough, if you have sufficient determination. Or it may be that you've got determination not to give up, and then you just can't do it. It's like the karmic conditions are just preventing you. I mean, you're just going to like die before you get there, that kind of thing. So that's possible. And I'm just going to move on to Siddhartha's next question after the first question had 4 question marks, which is, let's see here. It's all in quotes for some reason. I have a very rational mind. Sometimes I'd even say too rational or maybe too Western. I know that faith is a shield, but for me, I find it very difficult to believe in Deva's heavenly realms or the Buddha's miracles, as the Tibetans describe them. Do you think it's possible to reach enlightenment purely through reason or panya? Well, according to Theravada, it is not possible to reach enlightenment purely through reason or panya, because panya, or reason in this case, is one of the 5 balas, one of the 5 powers, or also, strangely, it's one of the 5 faculties of the 5 indriyas. And 4 of these faculties or powers are paired up. So panya, which here means more reason than really wisdom, is paired up with faith. Siddha and panya, they have to be in balance. If you have too much of one, you have too much faith and not enough reason, then you can believe anything no matter how ridiculous it is. But if you have too much reason and not enough faith, you become skeptical to the point of it just kind of immobilizes you. And the Visuddhimagga, which is the main commentarial work in Theravada Buddhism, says that a person with too much panya, not enough saddha, is like a person who is sick and their sickness is caused by the medicine that they take. So if you just try to make it through pure reason, then, I mean, pure reason can't really motivate anything. It's the faith that motivates you. So, I mean, I mean, you wouldn't even really be practicing if you didn't have enough faith. That's one thing I used to say, like, I'm kind of the same way, that I prefer reason to faith. I consider faith to be ultimately delusional. Faith is, believing something that you don't have sufficient grounds to believe, thinking that you know something that you don't really know, that kind of thing. And so I would tell people in Burma, I just don't have much faith. I'm more Panya oriented. And they say, well, I mean, you're dressed in monk's robes. You've traveled halfway around the world to live in this blazing hot wasteland with people that you didn't grow up with. You don't know them. I mean, that requires a certain amount of faith, doesn't it? And I had to admit, yeah, I guess so. I can say that I don't have much faith, but nevertheless, I was inspired to become a Buddhist monk with the intention of becoming enlightened, or at least to get as close to it as I could manage, that kind of thing. So I actually did have probably more faith than I realized. And I mean, if you're a Buddhist, there's going to be a certain amount of faith involved. It's like before you become enlightened, you still have to have faith in the idea that there is such a state as enlightenment. You have to believe without any proof that there was actually a person called Gautama Buddha who taught this stuff and that he was enlightened. So, I mean, you could sort of rationalize it and call it convenient working hypotheses, but still it's pretty much more a matter of faith than reason. That is, if it's going to be motivating you to practice, even that is more a matter of faith than reason. Like Immanuel Kant said, I don't know if he said it in his critique of pure reason, but he did say that, and David Hume was the same, that pure reason can't motivate anything. That you have to have like value judgments in order to inspire you to actually act. So that may be where your faith comes in addition to just believing that Buddhism is true without any actual proof of it. I mean, some aspects of Buddhism, you can see the truth of it. Like if you have enough insight, if you're capable of introspection, you can see that the first and second noble truths are pretty self-evident. And the third noble truth, I mean, that's just a logical consequence of the second noble truth. I mean, if all suffering is caused by desire, then if you don't have the desire, you don't have the suffering. So it's like the third noble truth is just a logical consequence of the second. The faith comes in mainly with the fourth noble truth. And that's practice. So, considering that Siddhartha Lohachita technically asked 5 questions, because there are 5 question marks, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Dimensional Fuse. So he probably got teased a lot when he was a kid in school with a name like that. And he says, you mentioned before that psychedelics were a spiritual activity for you. You just mentioned taking ayahuasca too. That was in the previous Q&A. Is this still a part of your spiritual journey, or since your time as a monk, is it no longer useful or helpful? Well, yeah, before I became a monk, psychedelics were kind of my spiritual practice. Like I've mentioned before, I'd go off into a forest by myself, some remote wilderness area, and like take LSD, that kind of thing. And when I was younger, almost always I'd have religious experiences when I would take LSD. But mainly now, I mean, I have taken similar substances after I stopped being a monk. I took, let's see, even when I was a monk. As I've gotten older, though, I've noticed it has a different effect on me. That LSD, when I was younger, I mean, it would just kind of blow my mind wide open. And, like almost always I'd have religious experiences. As I got older, it would cause sort of a headachy feeling. And it didn't have as profound as an effect on me as it did when I was younger. So there's that. I mean, ayahuasca is kind of in a class by itself because it's not nearly such a head trip. It's more of a visceral thing for me. But still, I mean, I have had like religious experiences on psychedelics, within the past 10 years. But I mean, one of the reasons why I don't take it nearly as much as I did when I was younger is I just don't have any connections. I wouldn't know where to get it. So I'm just doing fine without it. I got a woman now who worries about stuff like that anyway. So, I mean, there's also that as kind of a foot on the brakes. But there is a good chance that I will do it again someday. And I guess I should just move on to the next question. But yeah, I mean, I would be taking it more often if the guy who lived next door happened to have a good supply of such substances, that kind of thing. Which is not the case now. So you just take life as it comes. You just deal the hand that you are dealt. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Throat Warbler Mangrove. I believe that is how you pronounce his name, spelled Kriel. And he says, is consuming cannabis against the fifth precept of taking no intoxicants? And I've discussed this before. In fact, I think I've done an entire video on this with my friend Brian, maybe not. But in just dealing with monks, like the rules of monastic discipline. And if it's okay for monks, it should be okay for lay people too, because the rules are much stricter for monks than for lay people. And monks are allowed to use banga or cannabis for medicinal purposes. In fact, the rules of monastic discipline even allow a monk to own a pipe for inhaling the fumes of burning medicinal substances. It doesn't specify that it's just for cannabis, but it does specify that monks can use cannabis so long as it is for legitimate medicinal purposes. Whereas doing it recreationally would be against the rules. At the very least, it would be a dukkha offense, a minor offense of wrongdoing for taking a medicinal substance without there being a legitimate medical need for it. But I have to admit, when I was a monk, I did smoke cannabis quite a few times, especially my last maybe 10 years as a monk, because that's when I started dealing with Westerners. I think, it's almost every single time I got any weed as a monk, it was some Westerner giving it to me. And I was starting to meet more Westerners, especially in Burma, after like 2012, I guess, when Burma kind of opened up. 2011 or 12, started being more Westerners coming into the country, and then they'd be like offering me a hit off their pipe or something. But it's kind of like a borderline. I'd be taking it partly for spiritual reasons, in a sense, sort of like the psychedelics I mentioned in the previous question, where it can have like beneficial effects. I mean, cannabis for me, it's not so much mind expanding. It's not like necessarily lifting you up to a higher level of consciousness, but you're stepping sideways. It's like you're having like an alternative kind of consciousness, which can actually give you insights. It can help you kind of triangulate on samsara a little better. That you have more than one point of view, and it kind of helps you acknowledge that your usual way of looking at the world isn't necessarily the only way or the right way. It's just one of many ways of looking at the world. And then you take a bong hit or eat a gummy or whatever, and then you're all of a sudden you're like sideways a little bit, and you're looking at the same things from a different perspective, and it can kind of loosen your grip on attachment to some version of samsara. But if you're just doing it to get high, like as a way of escaping, then that's not so good. I mean, cannabis, it can be like alcohol too, which is strictly prohibited. It's against the rules for a monk to drink alcohol, even by accident. If he just accidentally drinks something alcoholic, he's got to make confession for that. He has broken the rules. So, in a way, cannabis is considered not as bad as alcohol in Orthodox Theravada Buddhism. But still, if you're doing it for recreational purposes, then it'd probably go under the precept of, I undertake the precept of abstaining from ale, wine, and other intoxicants which cause cloudedness of mind. So if the cannabis is just kind of dumbing you out, sort of like narcotics or something, just kind of putting you into a, kind of a stupor, then yeah, that's not good. But for me, it's like I'd have these urges to do walking meditation if I would get high as a monk. It's just walking meditation goes it's so much nicer for some reason. But it's going to definitely be dependent upon your mental states, like your attitude. That just an outward act is sort of morally neutral. It's the mental states associated with that act. So if you've got glaucoma or something, and cannabis helps with that, or you've got some other kind of, it could even be like a psychological, just like stress. Stress could be considered a kind of medical problem, and it just helps you to relax and calm down, that kind of thing. So long as it's not stupefying you, then that could be a legitimate use for it. But that would be controversial. You'd have people, like the hard-nosed, like moralists would say, no, that's just wrong. You shouldn't do it. And then other people say, well, you got reasons for taking it, But yeah, I definitely prefer cannabis to alcohol, personally. Anyways, just getting back to the question though, is consuming cannabis against the fifth precept of taking no intoxicants? It depends on the circumstances, and it depends on your motivation, your reasons for taking it. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Ryan. Ryan says, I've watched several of your videos with Ajahn Punadamo. Your knowledge depth reminds me of Bhikkhu Samahita, R.I.P., from Denmark. He committed a word that you're not supposed to say on YouTube. Do you know who this bhikkhu was? His vids are still on YouTube. And I had never heard of him until I happened to meet somebody who knew him. And so I learned about this Danish monk, Samahita, from this other person who was telling me about him, how they had been communicating and so forth, and how this bhikkhu, I think it was after his father died or something, it was like he had some kind of episode that he kind of became unhinged or some such. At least he appeared that way to people who knew him. And then he self-deleted. But yeah, I can't recall. I might have seen briefly like one video from him, but it didn't make much of an impression on me. And so I really do not recall him. I don't remember what he looked like or any such thing. And so I guess I might as well just move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, do you think the Bodhisattva ideal might have been the result of contacts with early Christianity in the areas of West Asia around the 1st and 2nd centuries? I consider it unlikely. There are a lot of people who believe that doubting Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, actually went to like southwestern India, and that there are actually Christians in southwestern India that have been there since ancient times that consider Saint Thomas to be the founder of their Indian Christian tradition. But it would have happened so soon. It's like Mahayana was already beginning to arise by the time of Jesus of Nazareth. And the Bodhisattva ideal was probably already well established by the time Christianity ever found its way in India. So what I think happened with the Mahayana Bodhisattva ideal. I think I got this idea from Francis Story, who was like one of the early Western writers about Buddhism. This is like back in the 1950s, kind of like Edward Kanze, those kind of guys. And he was saying that the Bodhisattva ideal, which is probably a mistranslation of the Pali word bodhisatta, that bodhisatta probably has the satta part being a kind of past participle of the verb sajjati, which is to be bound for, to be attached to be dedicated to. So probably bodhisatta in Pali meant someone who is bound for enlightenment. It meant someone who was destined to become a Buddha, but hadn't become a Buddha yet. But apparently, early Mahayana Buddhists didn't quite understand the etymology of the word bodhisatta, and so they assumed satta meant being. And so a bodhisattva is considered to be a kind of enlightenment being, which is kind of ironic because a bodhisattva, I mean, traditionally isn't someone who is someone who's postponing enlightenment indefinitely until all beings are saved, even though all beings ultimately don't exist. So anyways, you had the glorification of the Buddha. Like when Buddhism became more of a popular religion, you have more kind of normie type people who are more devotionalistic than really inclined to practice strict Dhamma for the sake of becoming enlightened. They want to just worship, some great being, some godlike being. And so they started glorifying the Buddha. And one of the ways that they glorified the Buddha was through Jataka stories, where they would there'd be these stories called Jatakas, where a lot of them started off just being fables, sort of like Aesop's fables in India, sort of like you find like in a text of Indian fables like the Pancha Tantra or something like that, where they would just become Buddhicized. The hero would be the Buddha in a previous life, and some of the other characters in the story would be some of the Buddha's chief disciples. And then at the end of the story, he would point out, I was this wise rabbit, and Venerable Sariputta was the wise otter or whatever. And anyways, with this kind of glorification of the Buddha, it started separating the Buddha from his disciples, where he was considered to be just vastly beyond any other enlightened being. So his arahant enlightened disciples still were nowhere near to being at the level of the Buddha, even though, the Buddha was, he was essentially saying, I became enlightened, you can become enlightened too. And when you're fully enlightened, it doesn't get wiser than that. Full enlightenment is maximum wisdom. So I do think that the whole idea of a Buddha being just qualitatively way above an ordinary enlightened being, I consider that to be largely the result of the glorification of the Buddha, which is just a human thing. The Christians turned the founder of their religion into God Almighty. Buddhists didn't go quite that far, but they went a hell of a lot farther than the Muslims did. So probably the Bodhisattva ideal just came from glorification of the Buddha, just showing how, it's so much nobler and better to dedicate just eons and eons to perfecting all of your paramis so that you can become fully enlightened without even needing a teacher. And Christianity was, it arose around the same time that Mahayana was arising in India. So I don't think that there would be much likelihood of the Bodhisattva ideal coming from Christians. And so I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, you have claimed before that religious figures like Muhammad might have had epileptic seizures, and modern neuroimaging has shown that people have people having mystical experiences are heavily correlated with the temporal lobe, which is also related to temporal lobe seizures. The same is true when you give people drugs like mushrooms and they claim to have mystical experiences and heavily involve the temporal lobe. Maybe mystical experiences are just the brain short-circuiting, and since the brain is always trying to explain things and it has no subconscious understanding of itself being a biological computer that's short-circuited, my woman's computer, my backlight, or the light that helps light up these things. Okay, let's go like this. Now, I was supposed to jiggle the mouse every once in a while to keep it from going off, but it didn't work. Okay, I'll just have to jiggle the mouse every now and then, I guess. Okay, let's get back to Psychedelics Psychedelics before the computer so rudely interrupted me. Maybe mystical experiences are just the brain short-circuiting, and since the brain is always trying to explain things and it has no subconscious understanding of itself being a biological computer that's short-circuited, it comes up with a rationalization that this is somehow something spiritual or divine, as something beyond itself and the world, but in reality, rather than being a divine intervention, it's nothing but a result of being a biological slave to chemical reaction of the physical brain, and Psychedelics and Psychedelics, you should be ashamed of yourself. What do you make of this theory as a biologist? Well, I actually came across this theory. It was like in Time magazine or maybe Newsweek magazine. I think it was when I was a monk, and I just went to some place that had this stack of old Time and Newsweek magazines. Or maybe some other monk just bequeathed onto me this stack of Time and Newsweek magazines that I was just systematically looking through just to see all the stuff that I missed in the news over the past 20 years. And they had some article about they were doing some kind of a PET scan, I think it was called positron emission topography or something like that, where they can see what parts of your brain are active when you're doing something or not doing something. And so they'd have somebody meditating, like in a deep meditative state. I think it was mainly Tibetan monks. And they would find that certain area of your brain that usually is lit up goes dark. And then, of course, the materialists, the followers of scientism who are writing the article are saying, there you go. It's like that part of your brain that acknowledges multiplicity goes dark, and so it's just turned off, and so you have this illusion that it's all one. But really, I mean, they just completely ignore the possibility that part of your brain isn't acknowledging pre-existing multiplicity, it is generating multiplicity. So let's see here. I'm not sure if I claimed that religious figures like Muhammad may have had epileptic seizures, but in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, Prince Mishkin, who is like this Christ-like figure who has epilepsy, thinks about Muhammad, how Muhammad supposedly, he had some kind of, made a trip all the way to, I can't remember if he went to heaven or not, this while the pitcher was tipping over. It was before any water actually spilled out and hit the floor, already he had gone to heaven and back, something like that. And Prince Mishkin was thinking, yeah, he must have had epilepsy, because the same kind of stuff happened to Prince Mishkin, how he'd have these mystical experiences right before having an epileptic seizure. But the thing is, I mean, your brain, I mean, even scientists will tell you this. The purpose of your brain is not to understand reality. The purpose of your brain is to keep you alive long enough that you can have babies. Preferably that you can have babies in such a way that your babies will live long enough to have babies. You gotta continue your DNA going. So the purpose of your brain is not to understand reality. Like the natural brain is not an enlightened, the natural brain doing its natural thing is not enlightened. So to assume that any deviation of the function of your brain from the natural way of things is going to take you farther away from reality. I mean, that's just wishful thinking, unless you've got some really hard evidence to support that. In some cases, no doubt, you have some kind of brain malfunction. It's going to take you, well, I don't know if it's going to take you farther away from reality, but it's definitely going to shift you into a different version of reality that most other people do not share. But just because your brain isn't like functioning normally or naturally, that doesn't mean that it's whatever the aberration is going to take you farther away from reality. I mean, it can take you closer to reality under certain circumstances. So, yeah, I'm not even sure if all, like, somebody like, who was that early Greek philosopher? Parmenides, who was just saying it's all one. I don't even know if he ever had a mystical experience. I mean, you can use just sort of like intellectual philosophizing to take you to the same conclusion. It's really not that difficult. That multiplicity is just like an artifact generated by perception. So, yeah, see, what's the actual question? Where is the question mark? Where is the damn it question mark? Okay, what do I make of this theory as a biologist? Well, still, I mean, I'm a mystic first and a biologist second, I guess. So my theory would be what I just said, that just because, I mean, your brain is not designed to know reality. That's just for starters. That's pretty basic. And so any malfunction or like aberration of brain function, it's not going to necessarily be taking you away from reality because you weren't in reality to begin with. In fact, there's a good chance that certain things, if they're just sort of stopped in your perceptual process, it will take you closer to reality. So that's my theory. And I'm just going to move on to Seovaction Sipat Zidana's second question here, which is saying it's all just empty and illusory just the Buddhist version of it's all just particles and chemical reactions for materialists? Well, I mean, obviously it's not just the Buddhist version of that. I mean, they're coming from very different positions. So, I mean, there's a little bit of overlap. So the Buddhist saying it's all just empty and illusory, and some materialists saying it's all just particles and chemical reactions. I mean, they can be used for similar motives. You can, as a way of sort of detaching from this samsara that we're so attached to. Although the materialists, they're just justifying clinging to a different samsara. Whereas a Buddhist, I mean, most Buddhists probably also are just promoting clinging to a different samsara, but at least it's not, that's not what it's supposed to be. You know, it's not like you're just preferring this version of reality to a different version of reality, or this model of how it is with some other model of how it is, which is what the scientists are doing, that it's all just empty and illusory, including all models. So the Buddhists are going farther in that direction, definitely, than some scientific realist, materialist type. But, I mean, they can be used for similar reasons as a way of helping you to detach from this melodrama. And so I guess I'm just going to move on to Seovaction Sipat Zidana's third question, which is, you have said there are suttas where the term Buddha is used synonymously for arahants. Based on this, wouldn't the Mahayana claim, allegedly, of anyone who is fully enlightened giving teachings of becoming enlightened be considered Buddhavacana? And there's kind of a backstory to this question, whereas recently on the Discord server, there was a lot of debate going on. There's a Pure Land Buddhist on the server who is saying that any teaching that will help you to become enlightened or that will inspire enlightenment is Buddhavacana, or literally words of the Buddha, or Buddha's words, Buddha's speaking. Yeah, literally it'd be Buddha speaking, Buddhavacana. And so Siovach is kind of saying that, I mean, if some other person, some other enlightened being can be called a Buddha, then whatever that person says could be Buddhavacana also. It depends on how you want to interpret, how you want to define the term Buddhavacana. At the time the term Buddhavacana arose, there was one Buddha. It's the words of the Buddha, not the words of any Buddha, not the words of some Buddha chosen at random. It was the words of the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, the great philosopher of the Shakya clan. And so, I mean, you could kind of call the teachings of some other enlightened being to be Buddhavacana, but I mean, how do you know? I mean, the Buddha was one person. You know that person existed. You might not know for sure that he was fully enlightened, but he was called the Buddha. And so what he taught was Buddhavacana, even if you don't even think he was fully enlightened. So long as you agree that he was called the Buddha, then his words were Buddhavacana. But then if you want to just sort of cut Buddhavacana loose from the founder of the Buddhist religion, and you just want to say any enlightened being, anything they say is Buddhavacana, well, that's a different kind of Buddhavacana, and you should certainly specify what kind of Buddhavacana you're referring to. And I mean, how do you know that someone who cooked up a Mahayana Buddhist text was enlightened? I mean, maybe. I mean, some Buddhist texts are very profound, although those are the ones that the Pure Land Buddhists don't have much use for. So, I mean, if you want to redefine a term away from, like the original intended meaning of it, it's like, is something Buddhavacana? It just means, did the Buddha really teach that? It doesn't mean that did some other enlightened being, let's say, for the sake of argument, that Neem Karoli Baba up there on the altar, there he is, that he was fully enlightened. Well, he was a devotee of Hanuman the monkey god. He really liked the Ramayana, the great story of Rama, and with the help of Hanuman the monkey king, going to Sri Lanka to rescue Rama's wife Sita from the demon Ravana. Well, I mean, that would be Buddhavacana too, wouldn't it? I mean, sort of. I mean, anything that he would say would be Buddhavacana also, including the stuff about Hanuman the monkey god. But, I mean, that would be pushing it. And, I mean, to just assume that the teachers of, say, Pure Land Buddhist texts were enlightened beings, when, I mean, the Pure Land Buddhists are saying there is no enlightenment in the world anymore. Except maybe for, the early ones who were teaching this stuff. But I mean, Pure Land Buddhism is teaching you can't get enlightened in this world anymore. It's the Kali Yuga. So you pray to the mythological space Buddha to save you. Or you recite his name over and over again, and then that will cause some kind of merit. Or with his help, maybe, you wind up being, in a way, reborn into this pure land, but in a way, in this sense that I do not comprehend, that you've got this realm, this pure land, which nevertheless isn't in samsara. Which, I mean, it's just turning the teachings of the original Buddha on its head. I mean, when you've got a teaching that is teaching in some ways the opposite of what the historical Gautama Buddha was in all likelihood teaching, then how can you call that Buddhavacana? Just any enlightened being, which would include, non-Buddhist, like Hindus, or like St. John of the Cross, that say St. John of the Cross is fully enlightened. Well, anything he said about Roman Catholicism would be Buddhavacana. I mean, it's it's loosed from its moorings. You've got like a boat that's just floating adrift at this point. So let's see here. What is the actual question? There are suttas where the term Buddha is used synonymously for arhants. Yeah, there are a few. Based on this, wouldn't the Mahayana claim, allegedly, of anyone who is fully enlightened giving teachings of becoming enlightened be considered Buddhavacana? Well, again, Neem Karoli Baba, Ramana Maharshi, maybe St. John of the Cross, maybe Meister Eckhart. Just Buddhavacana. I mean, you could have an enlightened Sufi turning the Quran into Buddhavacana. Yeah, I mean, you've loosened the word so far away from its original intended meaning that it becomes almost meaningless. It certainly becomes a far cry from what it originally meant. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskaziz, who recently joined the Discord server. And he says, why desire to be happy is a cause of suffering? Well, desire itself pretty much is suffering. So desire for anything is pretty much suffering, isn't it? And it's like desire is like you would prefer that things be different. Or you would prefer that things be a certain way, which isn't necessarily in accordance with the way things actually are. And so it's like a friction against reality. It's like struggling against the way things are. Even a desire to be happy is a cause of suffering, because it's like you're not just accepting the way things are, you are preferring or pushing, I mean, sort of mentally pushing. Just physical pushing is just neutral. But it's like you're creating friction against the way things are by trying, like, wanting. It's hard to define this, because I mean, it's hard to say to define desire without just throwing in like wanting or desiring or preferring. You know, it's really a strange situation. I'm not sure how to define the word desire without using a synonym for desire in the definition. But essentially, you're struggling against empirical reality, even if you're doing it in a very subtle manner. And that's suffering. I mean, desire itself is suffering. Even if it's desire for happiness, desire for enlightenment, you eventually, before you become enlightened, you have to get rid of that last desire. So long as you desire enlightenment, you're never going to be enlightened. You have to stop desiring even enlightenment in order to become enlightened. It may be very useful at first. It's like skillful means. It's guiding you in that direction. And for an ordinary normie, just like desiring money may help them to get money. Desiring a certain woman may help them to get that woman. But still, there's going to be suffering involved. It's just the way it is. And I guess I've spoken enough on that. It was a short question anyway. And so I'm just going to move on to the second question of Cherzaskaziz, which is as follows. If materialism isn't true, why, when we take material medicines, for example, for boosting our dopamine or serotonin level in our brain, they actually work and people feel ecstatic or calm and happy? My advice, if you really want to understand how all medicines work through the placebo effect, read Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Reverend Teacher Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science. That book is like the second Bible to the Christian Scientists. That she explains how all medicines work by the placebo effect. It's your faith in the medicine that works. Or even if it's like a blind test or something, it's like the faith in the people who give you the medicine. You know, it's like this common shared belief that keeps samsara going, keeps this version of the world going, this common shared belief that if you really believe something, like just pure faith, you have like this pure belief in something, it's true, including your belief that medicines will make you feel better, that whatever it is. And she has lots of weird stories, like let's see, what would be a good example? Just like people with certain mental illnesses that they have these weird beliefs that actually, like there was this one woman she mentions who had this mental breakdown when she got jilted on her wedding day, kind of like Miss Havisham in a Charles Dickens novel. But it was like her time froze for her at this certain age in her life. And even when she was very old, she looked like she wasn't old. This kind of stuff. Or Mary Baker Eddy, like there's this section after Science and Health, before you get to Key to the Scriptures, but there's this appendix to Science and Health called Fruitage, which is testimonies of people who cured themselves or were cured from reading this book. And I mean, a lot of it is stuff that has psychosomatic elements like tuberculosis or asthma or just bad vision, this kind of thing. Those are known to have psychosomatic elements. Not that tuberculosis is, just purely made up in your mind necessarily, but it's known that your mental states have a strong effect on whether you get it or not. How badly you get it, that kind of thing. So, I mean, some people, there's one person who was cured of a broken arm from reading Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And another person, the very first story, it was like a 40-pound fibroid tumor, where they had this tumor, then they're reading this book explaining to them that it's all mind-made, because Christian scientists don't believe in physical matter. And also they don't believe in any kind of illness. The idea is God is good. God would create only what is good. God would not create diseases because diseases aren't good. Therefore, they don't really exist. So, I mean, it's a kind of placebo effect, essentially, at least going with this idea of like, physical matter doesn't really exist kind of thing. I mean, there's other ways, other approaches, like George Berkeley, who also did not believe in physical matter, would have had a different interpretation. It's just God is implanting all these perceptions into your mind. So God implants the perception of you taking the medicine, and then God implants the perception of you getting better, even though the medicine didn't cause you to get better, God did. That kind of thing. So there's different ways of explaining it. But mainly it's faith. Faith in samsara keeps this version of samsara going for us, which includes the idea that if you take medicines or go to a doctor and get some sort of procedure done, that you're going to get better. Or at least, I mean, it doesn't always work that way, does it? But, it's going to have some kind of effect. Read Mary Baker Eddy. She'll explain it to you. And I'm just going to move on to Cherzaskas's third question. Please explain to people that I am definitely not Tig. And this kind of drama, I've spoken about this on a previous Q&A, how there was this guy named Tig who was kind of a smart aleck and was so smart alecky that he eventually got kicked off the server. Just completely irreligious, irreverent, just trolling. And so then this other person joins the server, and he's got certain attitudes resembling Tig. So a lot of people start suspecting this is just Tig trolling us again, pretending to be this other person. So then it started this joke going where, it's sort of like the Tig witch hunts, prove that you aren't really Tig. We start turning against each other, this sort of thing. And so a little bit of that was directed towards Cherzaskas's, who joined the server. It's like people, calling him Tig, prove that you aren't Tig, this kind of stuff. And he's taking it seriously. He thinks that people really think that he's Tig. But he's just kind of Tig. He's like a Polish Tig, maybe. Tig has many forms, just so many, an infinite number of Tigs. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, in this video, this is like the previous video. This question was found in the comments below the previous Q&A. So he says, in this video, you say Western culture is perverse for deifying a Hebrew. Do you then believe Christianity is perverse? Well, I meant it in a certain sense. That when I said that Western culture perversely, set itself up for the whole JQ by deifying a Jewish person. I mean, what the hell did they expect? I mean, you've got these people nowadays, these right-wingers, some of whom are even Christians, who, they despise the Hebrew race. They consider the Hebrews responsible for so many of the world's ills. But at the same time, they just kind of overlook the elephant in the room, which is that Western civilization, pretty much as a whole, converted to worshiping a Jewish person, which is largely responsible for the Hebrews still being a discrete ethnicity instead of just going the way of the Phoenicians and just blending in with everybody else. So, do I believe Christianity is perverse? Some of it I consider to be like absurd, unfounded, unwarranted assumptions. I think that Christianity is largely, not entirely, but largely based on unwarranted assumptions. Pure Land Buddhism would be another case in point. It's just these beliefs you have to adopt that you couldn't possibly prove. There really is no empirical evidence really supporting it. But it's just the insanity of the religious mind is willing to accept these assumptions and just fervently believe that they're true when really they've got no evidence other than just everyone around them believing similar stuff. So it's sort of like, what is it? Some kind of bias, validation bias, something like that. The exact term is escaping me. So, Christianity, is it perverse? I mean, I would consider certain aspects of it to be absurd, and even early Christians acknowledge this. It is absurd, therefore I believe it. This kind of stuff. But, I mean, the real perversity of it wasn't Christianity in and of itself. If it had remained like a reform movement of Judaism, now I wouldn't have as much bad to say about it. But for Western culture to just abandon its own spiritual traditions in favor of a largely absurd group of assumptions that, it's more Western culture adopting it being, in a way, kind of perverse than the system itself. And perverse doesn't mean like depraved, anything like that. It just means sort of like, what would be, I'm trying to use perverse in the definition again, but it's just sort of like deviating from what would be viewed as like appropriate, or just, I don't know how to explain it, but it's just sort of like willful, just going against oneself, or just willful deviation from what would be a healthier or more dharmic point of view. I don't know. But Christianity itself is not necessarily perverse. I think there's a lot of absurdity involved, but it's just Western culture abandoning its own indigenous spiritual traditions in favor of this largely absurd group of assumptions. That this Jewish man is the creator of the universe, who died for our sins, which came from a man made of soil, a woman made from a bone, being tricked by a snake into eating some fruit. So I'm just going to move on to Phil Lathy's second question. Overall, do you prefer Tolstoy or Dostoevsky? And from the one you choose, which novel is your best? Well, I prefer Dostoevsky to Tolstoy. Tolstoy was actually a socialist, and he tries to sneak in a little socialism. Like War and Peace one of the main reasons why he wrote War and Peace. It wasn't necessarily socialism, but it was sort of trying to destroy the proto-fascistic idealization of Napoleon. That, I mean, he keeps going off on these tangents in War and Peace. If you've read War and Peace, you might remember this. He keeps going off on these tangents of how Napoleon, I mean, he didn't do anything great. I mean, he was just a product of his times. If Napoleon wasn't there, someone else would have been lifted up and have been just like the carbon copy, just the same as Napoleon, this kind of stuff. Because really, he was trying to exorcise the ghost of Napoleon by writing War and Peace, because he just figured, Napoleon was the wrong direction. We should be going into more softer, more compassionate, more, equal kind of an approach. That was his attitude largely. Dostoevsky started off as a socialist and then was cured of that big time in a prison camp in Siberia. And like in one of his great novels, The Possessed or the Devils, is interpreted or translated variously. He's got socialists as symbols for Satanists, essentially. So he just did a 180 on that one. But with regard to who was the greater novelist, I still think Dostoevsky, even setting aside their politics. Dostoevsky just had this, I mean, he was down in the trenches. He understood humanity from the bottom up. Tolstoy was more like on Olympus, gazing down like Zeus on the struggling masses, whereas Dostoevsky was down there struggling with the masses. And he just had this profound insight into just finding divinity even in just the quagmire of human filth. So anyways, yeah, I definitely prefer Dostoevsky to Tolstoy, although Tolstoy is no slouch. I mean, I'm not saying that Tolstoy was like a bad writer or any such thing. He was still a giant, but I just like Dostoevsky better. And my favorite novel is Dostoevsky's The Idiot. It is a profound novel, and it's weird that The Idiot, I mean, you can read it at least 3 different levels. There's the level of what's actually going on. Prince Mishkin, he falls in love with Nastasia, and she's got this self-destructive streak, because of her pride and so forth. And there's this guy Rogozhin who's also trying to get the girl, and so on and so forth. And then at a different level, it's Christ and the devil struggling over the soul of the sinner, with Nastasia being the sinner. Also, in a way, she could be interpreted as Israel, but we don't need to get into that. That's kind of an obscure reference. And then also at another level, the whole book is apocalyptic. It's about the end of the world. But it's a great novel. Dostoevsky's The Idiot. It's probably my favorite novel. And so I'm just going to move on to Phil Lathy's third question, which is, generally, was being a monk fun? And then in parentheses, he says, sorry if this sounds a bit silly, but I don't know how else to word it. Being a monk, yeah, fun it's not really the best word. I mean, like like conducive to contentment. Yeah, sometimes. I mean, it's not supposed to be really pleasant other than just the joy of like meditation, practicing Dhamma, living a pure and peaceful life, that kind of thing. I did have a certain amount of fun, but I probably have more fun now than I did when I was a monk. So, yeah, I mean, it could be blissful at times, and then at other times it's just like you're staggering through a sandstorm, just blinded and lost. I mean, it could be like that sometimes too. So, yeah, I mean, I did have some adventures in Burma, rafting down the Patolone Creek, that kind of thing. That was kind of exciting. Hiking through Alondo Kathapa National Park, barefoot with no food. So, yeah, I mean, it definitely had its moments. It had its times of like just triumph and excitement and joy and all that. but it was definitely more subdued than a life of like a lay person. You know, it was like a monk is supposed to keep pleasure and pain to a minimum by just kind of taking this middle road between pleasure and pain, so to speak. But it definitely had its good points. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from somebody maybe called Tenku. And Tenku says, what do you think about Dipa Ma? And I really know about Dipa Ma just a little bit, kind of circumstantial, like reading. I read an article in a Buddhist magazine once about Dipa Ma, and just pick up little bits and pieces. I guess she was from Bangladesh. She was a Buddhist from Bangladesh. And for some reason, all the Buddhists in Bangladesh have the same last name, Barua or something like that. So maybe her last name was originally Barua. But she was considered to be like very highly advanced. She was a Theravada Buddhist, not an ordained nun, but I mean, they didn't have ordained nuns back then. So, I mean, she was just like a spiritually very talented person who was very advanced. And that's really about all I know about her. I don't think she's alive anymore. She was a figure of the 20th century. I remember one anecdote where she came to America, and I mean, she was sort of idealized or idolized by sort of the leftist boomer Western Buddhist, because of course she was a spiritually advanced female. So, you know, so you got to have diversity and all that. But there was this story where somebody went to a cash machine, like in the side of it was like built into the side of a bank or something. And Dipa Ma was really kind of overwhelmed with compassion about the poor person who has to live inside that brick wall, can't see anything, that all they're doing is just exchanging money. She didn't know that it was all automated. But yeah, I don't know enough about her to know just how wise she was. And if she was wiser than me, then there'd be no way I could possibly know how wise she was. And that's the way, I mean, earlier on in this Q&A, a similar question came up where it's like, you know, how can you know? You know, it's like Eckhart Tolle, Alan Watts. I mean, if they're wiser than you, you cannot know how wise they are. And if you just don't know them, also, I mean, Dipa Ma, I just saw like an article and just heard a few things at random every now and then. That's all I know about her. So it's hard to say. In fact, it's pretty much impossible to say. But that's all I can say about her, because I really don't know much about her. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yuga U. And his first question is actually two questions, which we can just conveniently lump into one question, is how are you? How is life under tariffs going? Well, I'm fine. I mean, when I was a little kid, I used to hate grown-ups asking me how I was, because my mother instructed me when somebody asks you how you are, you say, I'm fine. But I didn't know what fine meant when I was like 3 years old. I mean, the only time I'd ever used the word was when I'm telling some grown-up how I'm doing. So I'm fine. And then how is life under tariffs going? Well, so far, there has been no significant perceptible effect of tariffs on my life, other than just reading about them or hearing about them in the news. That's it. You know, you got some panicky cowards who are freaking out, or just, you know, they're just cynical anti-Trumpists pretending to freak out because, you know, the tariffs, it could be so horrible. And, you know, they don't really have any confidence that Trump actually knows what he's talking about. In fact, Trump has been talking about tariffs since the 1980s. Yeah, there was some famous interview he did on the Oprah Winfrey show, you know, long before he ever got involved in politics. And so, you know, by the same token, long before leftists started hating his guts, where he was saying essentially the same thing. It's like, you know, countries like China are just taking advantage of us by having all these tariffs against American imports into their country, but we don't have similar equivalent tariffs against their stuff coming into our country, and something should be done about that. He's been saying that literally for decades, and there's a good chance he knows what he's talking about. So I'm fine with the tariffs thus far. So I'm just going to move on to Yuga-U's next question, which is, do you think that once some kind of a sacred teaching leaves its nest and becomes widespread, it is susceptible to corruption and originality can be lost? Like with Dhamma being now widespread, it doesn't even have to leave the nest. It doesn't have to become widespread even. I mean, all that happens is it gets into the hands of humans, and especially if the humans are not as wise as the founder, then it starts to degenerate. And that happened with Buddhism back when it was still in India. Ancient India. Long before it came to the West, I mean, there was all kinds of weird tantric stuff, the Pure Land stuff. It was just all over the board, from the ridiculous to the sublime. So it's just a matter of falling into the hands of unenlightened humans. Even some enlightened humans can have some pretty weird ideas, like Neem Karoli Baba, assuming that he was enlightened, again, worshipped Hanuman the monkey god. So, yeah, it's just, over time, things change. Everything is impermanent. That's one of the basic teachings of Buddhism. Everything changes, including Dhamma as an established religious system. It's just going to change over time, partly just through random drift. I mean, that's one reason how the ancient Buddhist schools arose. It was back then, in like Buddhism, it could spread only as fast as a monk could walk. And so you'd have isolation. These different monasteries, they'd be isolated from each other. 50 miles might as well be 5,000 miles today. And it'd just be like slight differences in emphasis. You'd have some teacher who was interested in one thing. He'd be teaching about that. And then, some other monastery 50 miles away would have a different teacher teaching, some other emphasis. And it would just gradually result in different schools splitting apart and drifting away from each other with no ill intentions at all. So let's see. Once some kind of a sacred teaching leaves its nest and becomes widespread, it is susceptible to corruption and originality can be lost. Well, you can still have original corruption, but I think he doesn't mean originality in the sense of like independent thought. I think he means like authenticity, faithfulness to the original teachings. And that was lost. I mean, Pure Land Buddhism, it's very different from what the historical Gautama Buddha actually taught. And that was ancient India. Pure Land Buddhism was actually one of the earliest schools of Mahayana Buddhism that is known today anyway. I was surprised when I read that. I think I read about it in, what's his name? A.K. Warder's History of India, or his History of Buddhism in India. So, yeah, it doesn't even have to leave the nest and become widespread for it to become corrupted. That it's just natural that it's going to become corrupted. The only way for it not to be corrupted is for it to be dead. That it just doesn't change at all. It just remains in stasis. That humans don't interact with it. Because if humans start interacting with it, different kinds of humans are going to be interacting in other ways, and it's just going to start diffusing, and certain aspects of it will become more corrupted, and it's just the way it is. It's impermanence, it's anicca. And so I'm just going to move on to Yuga-U's third question, which is, lonely people are looking love in AI companions, and care they give them back gives them much love and comfort. They are being criticized that love is fake and only in their minds. Is it not that all love is just in our minds, Thus, their love is no different. Okay, well, I mean, love, my interpretation of love is that genuine love is acceptance. To the extent that you accept somebody, then you love that person. To the extent that you reject somebody, then you hate that person. Love is acceptance. It's not an emotion at all. Like when the Bible says God is love, it's not saying that God is an emotion. God just accepts all of us perfectly. Therefore, God loves all of us perfectly. So, somebody who loves like an AI generated mate, I mean, love in the biological sense, love is a kind of mating instinct, then it's like a perversion of that, sort of like pornography is a perversion of biological mating instincts. So in a way, it'd be sort of like emotional pornography, something like that. And some guys fall in love with like girls, like webcam girls, that kind of stuff too. At least the webcam girl is able to respond to some degree, that he's not falling in love with, you know, just some chick that's in like a magazine or in a video or something. And then I guess the AI generated companions, you know, they've got like this generated love coming back, which is, that love is fake, presumably, unless the AI is advanced enough to actually be sentient. So, I mean, the AI love coming back, probably at this stage in technological development, is not real love. It's just a mimicry of love. So, I mean, the person's love for the AI mate can be genuine, but I mean, there's no love relationship. I'm not sure, like in a real, like a deep love relationship, you're creating a third being. You know, you've got person A and person B love each other, and then it generates this person C, which is the combination of the two. My woman and I are like that. We have like a group mind. Sometimes it's stronger than at other times. Sometimes we might seem kind of alienated from each other, especially like if we're in like a bad mood, whatever, you know, it's just sort of contracted or something. But still, there's like this third being, which is us. And I'm not sure to what extent you could have something like that with an artificial computer generated fake human. Especially when AI is not yet fully sentient and capable of generating, you know, genuine affection or anything like that. So, yeah, all love is just in our minds, I suppose. But, I mean, there's obvious differences between a man's love for a woman and a man's love for an AI-generated woman, partly because the woman loves him back, ideally. The AI-generated woman does not. And also, you just do not have the depth of feeling, because it's all just going one way towards an illusion. So, yeah, there is some genuine love in there. I mean, a guy loves his golf clubs. That's still love, too. May not be the profoundest kind of love, but it's still love. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we're getting close to the bottom here. We're down to our last two questions, which is kind of good. This isn't going to be nearly a 3-hour long one. Next question is from Raphael. And I do not fully understand this question. Raphael says, should one realize awareness without self-consciousness according to the anatta doctrine? Is that even possible? So to realize awareness, I'm not sure even what that means, to realize awareness without self-consciousness according to the anatta doctrine. And does this according to the anatta doctrine clause, or is it a phrase? I don't remember now. Does that apply to the entire string of words preceding it, or only to the self-consciousness aspect? I do not understand the question fully. But I guess what it means is To realize awareness, does that mean to become enlightened? To realize awareness without self-consciousness. Should one realize awareness without self-consciousness according to the anatta doctrine? I mean, can any of you guys tell me exactly what this means? To realize, okay, maybe it's not just realize awareness, but what you're going to realize is, in parentheses, awareness without self-consciousness. And then all of that you do according to the anatta doctrine. Whew. This is a surprisingly difficult question for me to even understand. To realize awareness, this is like a headache-inducing question because I do not fully understand it. To realize awareness, I mean, you can't just realize awareness. That could just be like a strange way of becoming enlightened. So you realize awareness without self-consciousness. Okay, so that's it. I mean, should you realize like consciousness that is not self-conscious? Well, of course. Yeah, it's possible if enlightenment is possible. Did I just answer that question? Man, because it's really just the sentence construction is such that it's difficult for me to figure out what exactly Raphael is asking. But I assume awareness without self-consciousness is like a verbal unit. And it's not just, should one realize awareness and then to do that without self-consciousness, but it's, should you realize, and then in parentheses, awareness without self-consciousness, and all of that in accordance with the doctrine of anatta. Well, of course. Yeah. Man. It's weird. This reminds me of Burmese, that the Burmese language is very abbreviated. And so a lot of it is just, you got to fill in the gaps just through your, it's like your harmony with Burmese cultural conditioning, that a Burmese person can just sort of say a few words, and because Burmese people tend to all think pretty much alike, that the other person can just fill in the gaps and knows what he's talking about. Like sometimes Burmese people would say, how long has it been? And I'm like, how long has what been? And they say, yes. And then I say again, like, how long has what been? And then they, yeah. And it's like, how do I answer the question? But the Burmese people know. I mean, they know what it means. I'm just going to go on to the next question. This is from Arian. This is the last question. And Arian says, can you teach us about guardian spirits in Buddhism and how they are mentioned in the texts versus culturally? I don't hear of this topic often, but I hear them mentioned in some chants. And yeah, I mean, in the Pali text, there's not much mention of guardian spirits. In fact, I cannot recall any mention of guardian spirits in the text, other than maybe something like in the Bahia Sutta. You had this non-Buddhist philosopher named Bahia, who lives on the west coast of India. And he's getting a lot of respect. You know, he's been practicing diligently and conscientiously in whatever system he belonged to. And the people were starting to believe that he was fully enlightened, until he started thinking, well, maybe I really am fully enlightened. And then a deity, a deva, who had formerly been like a relative of Bahia in a previous life maybe, comes to him and says, no, I'm sorry, you're not really enlightened, but there is this Gautama of the Shakya clan living far to the east who is enlightened. And so, I don't need to continue with the story, but I mean, that would be about as close as a mention of guardian spirits. You know, it's sort of like some deva or high-ranking peta even, who has some particular interest, possibly due to some relation in a previous life, who is sort of like keeping an eye on you, that kind of thing. I mean, there is some kind of precedent for that in the Pali texts, but that there is some deity who is assigned to be your guardian spirit, or it's like a position that everyone has one, and it's just sort of like a natural process of this deity who maybe is waiting for a convenient opportunity to be born as a human again, who's still interested in humans, who, it's their duty to like help you somehow. Sort of like the opposite of the screw tape letters, if you're aware, if you know what that means. That's really not found in the text that I can recall. It might be in there somewhere, but it certainly is not emphasized. So this idea of guardian spirits, it seems to be more of a Southeast Asian thing. I'm not sure what the Sri Lankans feel about this. It could be a cultural thing that is not found in the text. Like the Burmese definitely believe in guardian spirits, and the Thais apparently do too. And so in Burma, a lot of the time, if you're sending metta, like you've got a monk who's sitting in the front and he's guiding this metta meditation where you're sending metta to all these beings, and he'll have like the yokozone gnat and it's like the tree deities and the sky deities and the ground deities and so forth, and then he'll have the kosant gnat, that you're sending metta to your kosant gnat, which is your guardian spirit. And then you send metta to the ain sant gnat, which is the guardian spirit, not of you personally, but of your house, of your home. Sort of like the ancient Romans believed in that kind of thing. And then you've got like the guardian spirit of the neighborhood. And then you send metta to the guardian spirit of the city. And then you send metta to the guardian spirit of the state or province. And then you send metta to the guardian spirit of the country. And then you send metta to the guardian spirit of the world. And the Burmese consider the guardian spirit of the world to be Lokanata, who in the iconography is always kind of sitting with his legs, with his feet together. He's kind of sitting, maybe leaning a little bit to one side, and the soles of his feet are touching together. I don't know why. There may be some symbolic reason for that. And I guess, judging from the metta meditations led by monks in a Thai tradition, like in the Ajahn Chah tradition, they talk about guardian spirits too. So it may be more of a Southeast Asian cultural thing that has been incorporated into Buddhism, rather than this belief in guardian angels that, is fairly common in the West too, or at least used to be. That it could just be a kind of like an archetypal sort of belief that I grew up as a kid just believing that I had a guardian spirit because a Ouija board told me when I was a kid. The spirit came through. My father's guardian spirit. My father firmly believed in guardian spirits. His guardian spirit was a dead Vietnamese Buddhist monk named Tay Sing. That's what he called him. And they just met in a previous life, and this being just took an interest in my father and would keep an eye on him and communicate to him through mediums in trance occasionally. Wow, there's more coffee in there than I thought. Man. So it does seem to be like a universal phenomenon, believing in guardian spirits, but at the same time, I do not recall it being any kind of significant teaching in the Pali text or in like early like Pali Buddhism. So I do not know exactly when it got incorporated into Theravada Buddhism, but it's incorporated big time in Burma and probably in Thailand also. And like any kind of empirical truth or falsehood to the idea of guardian spirits, I'm not exactly sure about that either. It may very well be that there are going to be certain spirits out there who are particularly interested in you for whatever reason, due to past life associations or whatever. Or maybe they just kind of latch onto you as a way of sort of vicariously living in a meat body because they don't have one at present. Something like that. I don't know. But if you're in Thailand or Burma and you're sending metta with some monk leading the chant, there's a good chance you're going to be sending metta to your guardian spirit and also various other deities. I mean, they're generally considered to be a deva, but I would guess they'd be a relatively low-ranking, unfamous kind of deva if they are the particular guardian spirit of an individual person. And that's it. I just answered the last question. So, as I should always say at the beginning and never do, except maybe once, if you have any questions you think I can answer, particularly about early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, and then the farther away you get from Buddhism, especially Theravada Buddhism, the less likely I'll be able to give some intelligent answer. But there's still possibilities. I mean, I have many interests. And so, like Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy in general, mysticism, monasticism, like Burma, that kind of thing, I'm generally pretty good at answering. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already. And be happy.